Hello there, and welcome to the third part of my series on Toronto's old trolley bus network. In this video, I'm going to focus in on the Lansdowne division. So, let's get into the video. Before we start, I want to make a clarification on something I said in part 2. In that video, I said that the Eglinton division was the oldest, and this is true if you're counting from the original Mount Pleasant trolley bus in 1922. However, that route only ran until 1925, so its division's history isn't continuous. If you are starting from what we could call the modern trolley bus network, then the Lansdowne division is the oldest. As stated in the previous videos, Toronto's trolley bus network wasn't a single network but two separate networks, the Eglinton division and the Lansdowne division. Of the two trolley bus divisions that made up Toronto's trolley bus network, Lansdowne is the largest. Over the course of its history, 6 routes would operate out of the Lansdowne division, those being the 4 Annette, 6 Bay, 40 Junction, 47 Lansdowne, 63 Ossington, and 89 Weston. Lansdowne Garage would serve as the base of operations for the Lansdowne division. Due to the large number of routes operating out of the garage, it was actually too small to handle all of the buses needed. So, in the 1950s, the TTC would purchase a laneway south of the garage at Wade Avenue to store all the excess buses. This would be known as Wade Yard. The history of the Lansdowne division starts in 1946 when the TTC took delivery of a demonstrator bus from the Canadian Car and Foundry. After World War II, Toronto's large streetcar network was in need of restoration after years of deferred maintenance and high usage due to the war. However, at the same time, the TTC and the city were short on cash, and there was still a shortage of supplies in the immediate aftermath of the war. Because of this, the TTC would need to decide how it wanted to allocate the limited resources it did have for its streetcar network. This would manifest as a plan to focus attention and resources on the core of the streetcar network and convert the lesser used suburban routes into trolley buses. The TTC was impressed with the demonstrator unit it had received from the CC&F and decided to put its conversion plan into motion, starting with the Lansdowne streetcar. June 19, 1947 would mark the return of trolley bus service to Toronto with the opening of the Lansdowne trolley bus. This route would operate south from Lansdowne Loop, now Earls Court Loop, at St. Clair Avenue, along Lansdowne Avenue to Queen Street, performing an on-street loop via Queen Street, McDonald Avenue, and Seaforth Avenue. Some buses would short turn at Royce Loop at Dupont Street. 4 months later, on October 6th, the Annette trolley bus would enter service. This route would operate from Jane Loop at Bloor Street, north along Jane Street to Annette Street, and then east along it and Dupont Street to Christie Loop at Christie Street. There, one could transfer onto the Dupont streetcar to continue their journey downtown. This route was in effect a western extension of the Dupont streetcar, which the TTC had proposed extending to Jane Street in the 1920s, but never did due to the Great Depression and World War II. After the war, the TTC could provide this service to the residential and industrial areas west of Christie Street for the cheaper cost of a trolley bus, instead of constructing new streetcar tracks all the way to Jane Street. 2 months later, on December 8th, the Ossington trolley bus would enter service, replacing portions of the Dovercourt streetcar. This route would operate from an on-street loop in downtown Toronto via Adelaide Street, Crawford Street, King Street, and Shaw Street. The route would then travel north on Shaw Street, west on Queen Street, and north on Ossington Avenue to another on-street loop via Davenport Road, Oakwood Avenue, St. Clair Avenue, Alberta Avenue, and Mount Royal Avenue. At St. Clair Avenue, passengers could cross the street to Oakwood Loop and transfer to the Oakwood and Rogers Road streetcars, which were owned by the Township of York Railways. In the span of 7 months, the TTC had opened 3 new trolley bus routes with more to come in the following years. A year later, on September 13, 1948, the TTC would begin operations on its fourth trolleybus route, that being the Weston Road trolleybus, which would replace the old Weston streetcar. This route would operate from St. John's Loop on Weston Road near what is today Sydney-Belsey Crescent, and south along Weston Road and Keele Street to an on-street loop via Dundas Street West, Mavity Street, Annette Street, and back to Keele Street. The Weston trolleybus would be unique in the network as it would operate under the Township of York Railway's banner, as it operated outside of the City of Toronto's boundaries and into the Township of York and the Village of Weston. This distinction is important, as prior to 1954, the TTC's operational mandate was within the City of Toronto's boundaries, and service beyond would require an extra fare or be operated by a different operator. So the Weston Road trolleybus would operate with two fare boxes on board, one for areas north of the city limits at Avon Loop and one for the area south of it. Crossing this boundary would necessitate passengers pay an additional fare. In February of 1949, a new short-turn loop called Beresford Loop would open on the Annette route. This would be an on-street loop via Beresford Avenue, Lincoln Avenue, and Runnymede Road. On December 17, 1949, the Weston Road trolleybus would be extended north from St. John's Loop to Oak Loop at the intersection of Weston Road and Oak Street. Starting on October 1, 1950, Annette trolleybuses would be temporarily diverted due to construction of an underpass to cross the CP rail tracks west of Lansdowne Avenue. For this, buses would use wires temporarily strung up, following a diversion via south on Lansdowne Avenue, west on Lappin Avenue and Antler Street, and then north on Perth Avenue back to DuPont Street. This diversion would be in place until June 13, 1952. On October 16, 1952, the southern loop of the Weston Road trolleybus would change as it would no longer use an on-street loop. Instead, the intersection of Keele and Annette Street was redesigned, and now the Weston Road trolleybus would simply loop around the new traffic island at the intersection. In 1954, the operations of the TTC would be uploaded to the newly formed Metropolitan Toronto. Under the new regional government, the TTC's operational mandate would be expanded to encompass all 13 municipalities of Metro Toronto. Coinciding with this, the TTC would introduce a new fare zone structure. This change would have a large impact on the Weston Road trolleybus as it served three separate municipalities in Metro Toronto: the City of Toronto, the Township of York, and the Village of Weston. The TTC would construct a new short-turn loop at Northland Avenue for the Weston Road trolleybus. This loop would mark the boundary between fare zones 1 and 2. St. John's Loop in the Village of Weston would mark the boundary of fare zones 2 and 3. As well, the Weston Road trolleybus would be broken into three separate services. There would be the all-day service that operated the full length of the route from Oak Loop to Annette Loop, crossing all three fare zones. There would also be a rush hour only service which operated entirely within fare zone 1 from Northland Loop to Annette Loop. Lastly, there would be an occasional short-turn service operating from St. John's Loop to Annette Loop. In 1956, the TTC would begin numbering their bus routes. The Annette bus would be given the number 4. As well, it would have 3 branch line designations. The 4A would be buses operating from Jane Loop to Lansdowne Avenue before returning to the garage. The 4B would be used for occasional short-turn runs from Christie Loop to Beresford Loop. Lastly, there was the 4C for buses running between Beresford Loop and Lansdowne Avenue before returning to the garage. As well, the 4 Annette would also operate occasional short-turn runs through loops at Ossington Avenue, Keele Street, and Royce Loop. However, none of these appear to have ever had their own branch number. The Lansdowne trolleybus would be given the number 47 and have one branch designation, that being the 47A, for occasional short-turn buses operating from Royce Loop to Queen Street. The Ossington trolleybus would be given the number 63, and it had no branch routes at the time. Lastly, the Weston Road trolleybus would be given the number 89, and it would have two branch designations, those being the 89A for rush hour buses between Northland Loop and Annette Loop, and the 89B for the occasional buses that operated between St. John's Loop and Annette Loop. On July 26, 1959, the 89 Weston Road trolleybus would see a further extension to its route, with it being extended north from Oak Loop to the new Blondin Loop at Blondin Avenue. Just south of Albion Road, Blondin Avenue no longer exists. As well, a new on-street loop would be built in the village of Weston. Buses using this loop would do so via Church Street, George Street, and King Street. Buses would serve this new loop during rush hours only and use the 89A route designation. Buses serving the other short-term loops on the route would now use the 89S designation, with the 89B designation being eliminated. On January 3, 1960, the Oakwood streetcar would be abolished. The 63 Ossington trolleybus would be extended to fill in this gap, with the buses now running north along Oakwood Avenue to Eglinton Avenue and then west to Gilbert Loop at Caledonia Road. The route would also receive its first rush hour only branch service, with the 63A operating from King Street to the original on-street loop at St. Clair Avenue. This rush hour service would only last until March 21, 1965, however, when it was ended. Coinciding with the opening of the University extension of Line 1 on February 28, 1963, the DuPont streetcar would be abolished. With that, the 4 Annette trolleybus would be extended east from Christie Loop along DuPont Street, Davenport Road, and then south on Bedford Road to the new St. George Station. As well, the 4B service to Beresford Loop would be ended. At St. George Station, the 4 Annette trolleybus would utilize Bus Bay 1. On June 28, 1964, service to Gilbert Loop by the 63 Ossington trolleybus would be ended, and it would now use an on-street loop via west on Lanark Avenue, north on Glenholm Avenue, and east on Eglinton Avenue back to Oakwood Avenue. The opening of the Bloor Danforth subway in 1966 would bring some changes to the Lansdowne Division's trolleybuses. Firstly, the 47 Lansdowne buses would begin serving the new Lansdowne station, although as a through service, as a new off-street looping facility was not constructed at the station. The 63 Ossington would begin serving Ossington Station, with the route utilizing the station's bus terminal even though it operated as a through service. Southbound buses would access the station by traveling west on Northumberland Street, south on Concord Avenue, and then east through the station. Northbound buses would do the reverse. Lastly, the 89 Weston Road trolleybus would be extended from Annette Loop south on Keele Street to the new Keele Station. The next shakeup for the Lansdowne Division would come with the extension of Line 2 to Islington Station in 1968. Firstly, on May 11th, the 4 Annette trolleybus would begin terminating at the new Jane Station. Buses would access the Jane Station bus terminal from Jane Street and then travel south on Armadale Avenue and west along Bloor Street back to Jane Street. May 11th, 1968 would also mark the start of the 5th trolleybus route for the Lansdowne Division, as the new 40 Junction bus would begin operations. This route would operate from Dundas West Station north along Dundas Street West to Runnymede Loop, replacing the service formerly provided by the Dundas streetcar, which had been cut back to Dundas West Station. On April 20th, 1973, the 89 Weston Road trolleybus would see its route extended once more, this time due to the widening of Highway 401. The old Blondin Loop was to be torn up as part of this widening, and so the 89 Weston Road would be extended north to Albion Road. Buses would use an on-street loop running up the northbound ramp to Albion Road and then west to the west side ramp back to Weston Road. The early 1970s would see an increase to the number of branch designations given to the 63 Ossington. The 63A service between King Street and St. Clair Avenue was restored, although now only as an occasional short-turn route. The 63B would be used for buses running from Eglinton Avenue to Royce Loop before going out of service. The 63C would be used for buses running from King Street to Royce Loop before going out of service. The 63D would be used for short-turn buses running from Ossington Station to Eglinton Avenue. Lastly, there was the 63E for short-turn buses operating from Ossington Station to King Street. This whole numbering scheme on the 63 Ossington would get even crazier on July 21, 1974, when the 63 Ossington absorbed the service formerly provided by the Rogers Road streetcar. 2 new branch designations would be instituted for the trolley bus service along Rogers Road. Buses running from King Street to Bicknell Loop would be given the number 63F, while short-turn buses running between just Ossington Station and Bicknell Loop would be given the number 63G. However, for the sake of simplicity, the only designations that mattered to the average rider was the main route, the 63 Ossington, and the 63F to Bicknell Loop on Rogers Road. If all of that was hard to keep track of, then get ready because the ride isn't over yet, as September 5th, 1976 would see the 6th and final trolley bus route added to the Lansdowne division. On that day, the 6 bay bus would be converted to a trolley bus after the TTC had looked at routes which can be converted into trolley buses. You can learn more about this in part 1. As well, after the 97 Young was converted to diesel bus operations, the TTC had a surplus of trolley buses and needed something to do with them. The 6 bay would operate from an on-street loop, north on Freeland Street, east on Lakeshore Boulevard, south on Jarvis Street, and west along Queens Quay, and north on Bay Street, passing by Union and Bay stations to Davenport Road. The route would then travel west to another on-street loop via DuPont Street and Bedford Road. The 6 bay would also have 3 short-turn loops along its route, all of them on-street. The first being Bloor Loop via east on Davenport Road, south on Yonge Street, and west along Yorkville Avenue. The second being Dundas Loop via west on Edward Street, north on Elizabeth Street, and east on Elm Street. The last short-turn loop, called Front Loop, was via east on Front Street, north on Yonge Street, and west on Wellington Street. The 6 bay would become the busiest route in the trolley bus network, with 30 buses running the route during rush hours, operating at 1 to 2 minute headways. Due to its high ridership and route, the 6 bay would also have 5 branch services. The 6A was a rush hour service that operated from Bloor Loop to Jarvis Street. The 6B was a rush hour service that operated from Bloor Loop to Front Loop. The 6C would be used by short-turn buses operating from Front Loop to Jarvis Street. The 6D would be used by short-turn buses operating from Dundas Loop to Jarvis Street. And lastly, there was the 6E, which was used by rush hour buses operating from DuPont Street to Dundas Loop. January 28, 1978 would see the opening of the Spadina extension of Line 1, and with it, the 63 Ossington bus would be extended to Eglinton West Station. As well, the number of branch services would be reduced to 1, with the only branch being the 63F, which operated along Rogers Road. The 4 Annette trolley bus would also begin serving the new DuPont station, although no off-street loop facility was constructed. On January 4, 1983, the 63A rush hour service to St. Clair Avenue on the Ossington trolley bus was restored, although this time buses would now use Oakwood Loop as the catenary along Alberta and Mount Royal Avenues had been taken down. On September 6, 1987, the start of construction on the Harbourfront LRT would see the 6 bay trolley bus route split, with the trolley buses only operating as far south as Front Loop. Service south of Front Street to Jarvis Street would be handled by diesel buses for the duration of construction. The late 1980s would also see the City of Toronto and the TTC begin a project called the Bay Street Urban Clearway, which would see HOV lanes painted on Bay Street so that trolley buses could get around traffic on the street. In the summer of 1989, the TTC would begin taking delivery of leased trolley buses from Edmonton. These new trolley buses would need new roll signs, and the 6 Bay would receive 2 new branch lines in the process. The 6F would be used by buses operating from DuPont Street to Front Loop for the duration of construction of the Harbourfront LRT. The 6G would be used by rush hour buses traveling from Bloor Loop to Dundas Loop for the duration of construction of the Harbourfront LRT. The Harbourfront LRT would open on June 23, 1990, and with it, full service on the 6 Bay would resume. The 6F and 6G branch designations would be retired on this day. The end of trolleybus service for the Lansdowne division would come on January 18, 1992, when the 4 Annette, 6 Bay, 40 Junction, 47 Lansdowne, 63 Ossington, and 89 Weston Road were all converted to diesel bus operations. Or that was the plan at least. Those buses that had been leased from Edmonton were still under lease for 1 more year, and the Edmonton Transit Service wasn't going to let the TTC out of it. With a load of perfectly good trolley buses and nothing to do with them, the TTC would opt to restore trolley bus service on the 4 Annette and 6 Bay routes on September 4, 1992. These 2 routes would resume their normal operations until July 17, 1993, when trolleybus service was ended in the City of Toronto for good, thus ending 46 years of service. In the aftermath of the conversion to diesel bus operations, the 4 Annette would be renumbered to the 26 DuPont, its route unchanged. The 6 Bay would carry on with both its number and route until June 19, 2021, when it was renumbered to the 19 Bay, due to construction of the Finch West LRT, which will be known as Line 6 when it opens. The 40 Junction would carry on with both its route and number until October 12, 2019, when its route was extended to Kipling Station. The 47 Lansdowne would keep its number but absorb the 18 Caledonia bus in 1994, thus extending the route all the way to Yorkdale Station. This will change with the opening of the Eglinton Crosstown line, with the 47 Lansdowne bus being cut back to the new Caledonia Station. The 63 Ossington would keep its number, although its route through downtown Toronto would be altered slightly. As well, the branch along Rogers Road would be spun off into its own route, the 161 Rogers Road, on February 13, 1994. Lastly, the 89 Weston Road would keep both its number and its route. Lansdowne Garage would be converted to diesel bus operations after trolleybus service ended, although this would only be temporary as the garage was shut down in 1996 and then torn down. Today it is an empty lot. The nearby Wade Yard is now a laneway used for parking. Just as in the Eglinton division, you can still see the old catenary poles scattered around the routes that the trolleybuses used to run on if you look for them. Lastly, I'll briefly go over the off-street loops that used to be used by the trolleybuses. On the former 4 Annette, Christie Loop is now a grocery store, the traffic island at Ossington Avenue has been filled in, Royce Loop is now a condominium, and Jane Loop is now an office building. On the 40 Junction, Runnymede Loop is still in use by the 30 High Park bus. On the 47 Lansdowne, Earls Court Loop is still in use and sees service from the 47A Lansdowne and the occasional 512 St. Clair streetcar. On the 63 Ossington, Gilbert Loop is now Eglinton Gilbert Parquet, Oakwood Loop still sees the occasional 512 streetcar, and Bicknell Loop along Rogers Road was torn down in 2018 and redeveloped into a housing development. Lastly, on the 89 Weston Road, which had the most short-term loops, the traffic island at Keele and Annette has been filled in, although it existed up until 2007. Northland Loop is now houses, Avon Loop is still used by the 168 Symington bus. St. John's Loop is now a housing development. Oak Loop is now a gas station. And Blondin Loop is now a highway off-ramp. And with that, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Lansdowne Division trolley buses, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below, and don't forget to check out the other 2 videos in this series if you haven't already. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.